Look, before we talk about what happened on October 2, 1968, we need to understand something. This wasn't just one night of violence. This was the culmination of months, years, really, of tension building in Mexico. The students didn't just wake up one day and decide to protest. They'd been watching, learning, seeing what was happening around the world. It was 1968. Paris had erupted in student protests. Prague was pushing back against Soviet control. The United States was tearing itself apart over Vietnam and civil rights. Young people everywhere were saying enough is enough. And in Mexico? In Mexico, the students were watching a government that had ruled for decades under one party, the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. A government that talked about revolution but looked an awful lot like a dictatorship. The students were tired. Tired of corruption. Tired of authoritarian control. Tired of being told to sit down and shut up while their country was run by old men who'd forgotten what it meant to serve the people. So they organized. They marched. They demanded change. By late September 1968, the student movement had been going for months. Hundreds of thousands of students from universities across Mexico City had joined together. They weren't violent. They weren't trying to overthrow the government. They just wanted to be heard. But there was a problem. A big problem. The Olympics were coming. Mexico was about to host the 1968 Summer Olympics. It was a huge deal, the first time a Latin American country would host the Games. The government had spent massive amounts of money preparing. They wanted to show the world that Mexico was modern, stable, sophisticated. And here were these students. Protesting. Making noise. Making Mexico look chaotic right when the international spotlight was about to turn on. President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz wasn't having it. He'd made it clear, the protests needed to stop. One way or another. On September 23, the army occupied the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. Tanks rolled onto campus. Soldiers with rifles. It was supposed to intimidate the students into backing down. It had the opposite effect. The students were furious. The university was supposed to be autonomous, that's literally in the name. The government had violated that autonomy with military force. More students joined the movement. More people came to the protests. The government was getting desperate. The Olympics were going to start on October 12. That meant they had less than 3 weeks to solve the student problem. On September 27, the army left UNAM. It looked like maybe, just maybe, the government was backing down. That dialogue might be possible. The students organized a huge rally for October 2. It would be at the Plaza de los Tres Culturas in Tlatelolco. A peaceful demonstration. Families were invited. Speakers would talk about reform, about democracy, about the future they wanted for Mexico. It was supposed to be a celebration. A show of strength through peace. What the students didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the government had other plans. Plans that involved the military. Plans that involved snipers. Plans that would turn that plaza into a killing ground. 10 days before the Olympics, the Mexican government was about to commit one of the worst massacres in the country's modern history. And for decades afterward, they would lie about it. Cover it up. Threaten anyone who tried to tell the truth. This is the story of what really happened on October 2, 1968. The story the Mexican government didn't want you to know. The Plaza of the Three Cultures. That's what Tlatelolco was called. Three cultures, pre-Hispanic, colonial Spanish, and modern Mexico. All represented in one place. There were ancient Aztec ruins. A colonial-era Catholic church. And rising above it all, modern apartment buildings. The Chihuahua Building. The Nuevo Leon Building. Towers of concrete and glass representing Mexico's march into modernity. It was symbolic, this plaza. It represented Mexico's entire history in one space. Which is maybe why the students chose it for their rally. Or maybe it was just practical. The plaza was big. It could hold thousands. It was centrally located. Easy to get to. October 2nd, 1968. It was a Wednesday. School was in session. Work was ongoing. But thousands of students were planning to skip both and come to Tlatelolco for the rally. The organizers had permits. They'd notified the authorities. Everything was legal. Everything was above board. The rally was scheduled to start at 5 p.m. But people started gathering earlier. Students, teachers, journalists, parents with their children. This was supposed to be a family-friendly event. By late afternoon, estimates say between 5,000 and 15,000 people had gathered in the plaza. Some sources say even more. It's hard to know exact numbers. But it was a lot. A sea of people filling the space. The mood was good. Hopeful, even. There was music. Chanting. People holding signs calling for democracy, for reform, for dialogue. Speakers took turns at the microphone. Student leaders. Professors. They talked about their demands. About the need for political change. About building a better Mexico. Nobody was armed. Nobody was violent. This was a peaceful protest. The kind that happens in democracies all the time. But surrounding the plaza, things were different. Military trucks had been moving into position since morning. Soldiers. Lots of soldiers. The official reason was crowd control. Making sure things didn't get out of hand. But these weren't just regular soldiers. Mixed in with the military were members of the Olympia Battalion. A special paramilitary force created specifically to deal with the student movement. They wore white gloves. That's how you could identify them. White gloves or white handkerchiefs. So they could recognize each other in a crowd. And they weren't just surrounding the plaza. They were in it. Scattered through the crowd. Watching. Waiting. In the buildings around the plaza, especially the Chihuahua building. Snipers had taken position. Army snipers with high-powered rifles. Positioned to have clear shots into the plaza below. The students didn't know this. The families didn't know this. They thought they were at a peaceful rally. They thought they were exercising their right to assemble. To speak. To demand change from their government. They had no idea they were walking into a trap. Around 6 p.m., just as the rally was really getting going, something changed. You could feel it if you were there. People who survived talk about it. A shift in the air. A tension. And then the sky lit up. Flares. Red and green flares shot into the darkening sky from the Chihuahua building. Beautiful, in a way. Like fireworks. But these weren't fireworks. These were signals. Later, people would figure out what the colors meant. The flares were coordinating the attack. Telling the different military units when to move. When to strike. The students in the plaza saw the flares. They didn't understand what they meant. Some thought it was part of the protest. Some kind of display. Then they heard the first shots. Pop, pop, pop. For a second, nobody moved. Was that gunfire? Couldn't be. This was a peaceful protest. The military was there for crowd control, not. Pop, 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 pop. More shots. Faster now. And people started screaming. Because those were definitely bullets. And people were definitely falling. The massacre had begun. The thing about mass panic is that it's chaotic. Witnesses remember different things. Some swear the first shots came from the Chihuahua building, the snipers. Others say it started at ground level. Some say the military fired first. Others claim there were agitators in the crowd who shot at the military to provoke them. Here's what we know for sure. At approximately 6:10 p.m. on October 2, 1968, gunfire erupted in the Plaza de las Tres Culturas. And within minutes, hundreds of people were running for their lives. Maria Fernanda was 18 years old. A student at UNAM. She'd come to the rally with 3 of her friends. They'd been standing near the back of the plaza, listening to the speakers, when the flares went up. At first, I thought it was beautiful, she said years later, when she could finally talk about it. The colors against the sky. Then I heard the pops. Like firecrackers. And then Elena, my friend Elena, she just fell. Elena had been shot in the chest. She died right there, in the plaza, with Maria trying to stop the bleeding with her hands. The initial shots caused confusion more than panic. People ducked. Looked around. Tried to figure out what was happening. Then the real shooting started. From the buildings surrounding the plaza, automatic weapons opened fire. Soldiers on the ground raised their rifles and started shooting into the crowd. And the crowd broke. Thousands of people all trying to run at the same time. Pushing. Shoving. Trampling anyone who fell. But where could they run? The plaza was surrounded. Soldiers blocked every exit. And they weren't moving aside. They were shooting. Some people tried to run anyway. They were shot down. Bodies started piling up near the exits. Others tried to hide. Behind the ancient Aztec ruins. Behind cars. Behind anything that might offer protection. Roberto Sanchez was a journalist. He'd come to cover the rally. When the shooting started, he tried to use his press credentials to get to safety. I showed them my press card, he remembered. I said I was a journalist. They didn't care. They shot at me anyway. I had to run. I left my camera. I left everything. The soldiers weren't discriminating. Students. Journalists. Parents. Children. If you were in the plaza, you were a target. Teresa Lopez had brought her 2 young daughters to the rally. She thought it would be educational. Teach them about civic participation. About standing up for what's right. When the shooting started, she grabbed both girls and ran for the church. The colonial-era church at the edge of the plaza. Surely, she thought, they wouldn't shoot near a church. They did. Teresa made it inside with her daughters. So did dozens of others. They huddled in the pews, praying, while bullets shattered the stained glass windows. In the plaza itself, the killing continued. People were being shot. Trampled. Beaten. The Olympia Battalion, the men with the white gloves, moved through the crowd. They weren't just shooting. They were grabbing people. Student leaders, mostly. Anyone who looked like an organizer. They'd tackle them to the ground. Beat them. Then drag them away. Where were they being taken? Nobody knew. Into the buildings. Into military trucks. They just disappeared. The shooting lasted about 2 hours. 2 hours of sustained gunfire into a crowd of unarmed civilians. When it finally stopped, when the soldiers stopped shooting, the plaza was transformed. What had been a peaceful gathering was now a scene of carnage. Bodies everywhere. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Blood pooling on the ancient stones. Shoes left behind by people who'd run out of them. Bags. Banners. Signs calling for peace lying among the dead. And the screaming. God, the screaming. The wounded crying out for help. Family members searching for loved ones. The sound of a city breaking. The soldiers moved through the plaza in the eerie quiet after the guns stopped. Collecting bodies. Arresting anyone still alive and moving. Military trucks pulled up. Bodies were thrown in. Not gently. Not with any care. Just tossed in like garbage. The wounded who could walk were arrested. Those who couldn't were, well. Witnesses say some of the wounded were shot where they lay. Finished off. To eliminate witnesses. By midnight, the plaza was empty except for soldiers. The bodies were gone. The arrested were gone. All that was left was blood on the stones and bullet holes in the buildings. And the lies. The government's lies were just beginning. By the next morning, October 3rd, the Mexican government had its official story ready. And it was very different from what had actually happened. According to the government, the military had been forced to respond to violent agitators. Snipers among the students had fired first. The military had only returned fire to protect themselves and innocent civilians. The death toll? According to the government, 20 people. Maybe 30 at most. All of them agitators. Troublemakers. People who'd brought violence to a peaceful situation. President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz went on television. He looked calm. Measured. Reasonable. Last night, he said, a group of extremists attempted to create chaos in Tlatelolco. The armed forces, showing great restraint, responded only when fired upon. I want to assure the Mexican people and the world that our country is stable. Order has been maintained. The Olympics will proceed as planned. That was the message. Control. Stability. Nothing to see here. The newspapers the next day largely repeated the government line. Some were more obvious about it than others. But the message was consistent, the students had started it. The military had shown restraint. The death toll was minimal. But people who'd been there knew better. They'd seen the bodies. They'd heard the sustained gunfire. They knew that what the government was saying was a lie. Maria Fernanda, the student who'd watched her friend Elena die, tried to tell people what she'd seen. She called newspapers. She called radio stations. Nobody would listen. Or rather, nobody would publish what she was saying. They told me I was mistaken, she remembered. That I was traumatized and my memories weren't reliable. One editor told me that if I kept spreading unfounded rumors, I could be arrested for disturbing public order. The government moved quickly to control the narrative. Hospitals were told not to release information about patients who'd been treated for gunshot wounds. Morgues were instructed to sign off on bodies without detailed autopsies. Journalists who tried to investigate too deeply got visits from military intelligence. Some were arrested. Some just disappeared for a few days, long enough to be scared into silence. Foreign journalists were expelled from the country if they reported anything contrary to the official story. The government said they were spreading propaganda. Trying to make Mexico look bad right before the Olympics. And the Olympics. Everything, was about the Olympics. The games were going to start in 10 days. Decades of planning. Hundreds of millions of dollars invested. The eyes of the world about to turn toward Mexico City. The government needed the story to be that everything was fine. That the student movement had been a minor disturbance that was now resolved. That Mexico was modern, stable, ready to host the world. So that's the story they told. And they enforced it with every tool of state power they had. But they couldn't silence everyone. They couldn't control every whisper. Every photograph smuggled out. Every survivor who quietly told their story to someone they trusted. The truth was leaking out. Slowly. In fragments. But it was getting out. Foreign newspapers that couldn't be controlled by the Mexican government started publishing different numbers. The Guardian in London. Le Monde in Paris. The New York Times. They were hearing from survivors. From eyewitnesses who'd gotten out of Mexico. From journalists who'd been expelled but could now speak freely. And those newspapers were reporting death tolls in the hundreds. Possibly thousands. The Mexican government called these reports lies. Foreign propaganda designed to embarrass Mexico during its moment of glory. But around dinner tables in Mexico City, in quiet conversations between friends, in whispered discussions in university hallways, people were asking questions. How many people really died? What really happened in Tlatelolco? Why won't the government release accurate information? The massacre had happened. The government's lies were crumbling. But it would be decades, before the full truth would come out. Before documents would be declassified. Before witnesses could speak freely without fear. Before Mexico would have to confront what its government had done on October 2, 1968. In the immediate aftermath of Tlatelolco, families across Mexico City were searching for their children. Their siblings. Their friends. Because while the government was saying only 20 or 30 people died, hundreds more were simply gone. They'd gone to the rally and never come home. Their families called hospitals. Called police stations. Called anyone who might know anything. And they got nothing. No information. No bodies. No arrests records. Nothing. These people had disappeared. Disappearance, forced disappearance, would become a hallmark of authoritarian governments across Latin America in the 1970s and 80s. Argentina's dirty war. Chile under Pinochet. El Salvador. Guatemala. People would be taken by security forces and simply cease to exist. No trial. No charges. No body. Just gone. Mexico in 1968 was pioneering this technique. Ana Maria Jimenez's brother Carlos went to the Tlatelolco rally. He was a third-year engineering student. 21 years old. Smart. Passionate about political reform. He left the house around 4 p.m., Ana Maria remembered. He said he'd be home for dinner. He never came back. Ana Maria and her parents searched everywhere. They went to hospitals, all of them, across the entire city. No Carlos. They went to police stations. No record of an arrest. They went to the morgues. This was the worst part. Looking at bodies. Bodies of young men around Carlos's age. Trying to identify them. Terrified each time that it would be him. And then, in a twisted way, almost disappointed when it wasn't. Because at least then they'd know. After a week, they still had nothing. Carlos had simply vanished. The Jimenez family wasn't alone. Hundreds of families were doing the same thing. Searching. Pleading for information. Getting nowhere. The government's position was simple: if there was no body and no arrest record, then the person hadn't been at Tlatelolco. They must have run away. Or gone into hiding. Or left the city. But that didn't make sense. These weren't people with reasons to run. They were students. They had families. Lives. Responsibilities. They wouldn't just disappear voluntarily. Years later, decades later, some of what happened to the disappeared would come to light. Military trucks had carried away bodies. Lots of bodies. More than the government ever admitted. These bodies were taken to military installations. Some were cremated. Some were buried in mass graves. Some were dumped in remote locations. The arrested, and there were hundreds of arrested, not the dozens the government admitted to, were taken to military prisons. Not regular jails. Secret detention centers. There, they were interrogated. Tortured. Forced to sign confessions saying they'd been the agitators. That they'd fired first. That the military had only responded defensively. Some of these people were released after days or weeks. They came home with broken bones. Cigarette burns. Missing teeth. And a clear message: don't talk about what happened. Don't tell anyone what you saw. Or you'll disappear again. Permanently. Others were never released. They were killed in detention. Their bodies disposed of. Their families never told. Carlos Jimenez was one of these. His family would search for him for years. Decades. They'd never find him. In the 1990s, when Mexico began opening some of its archives from 1968, a document surfaced. It was an internal military memo. It listed subjects detained at Tlatelolco, October 2, 1968. Carlos's name was on the list. Next to it, disposed of. That's all. Disposed of. Like he was garbage. The memo didn't say how. Didn't say where his body was. Just, disposed of. Ana Maria was in her 60s when she found that document. The search for her brother had consumed most of her adult life. And this was all she got. 2 words. Disposed of. I wanted to know where he is, she said through tears. I wanted to bury him. To have a place to go. To mourn properly. But they took even that from us. The disappeared of Tlatelolco number in the hundreds. Maybe more. Exact numbers will never be known. The government destroyed too many records. Hid too much evidence. But each one was a person. Someone's child. Someone's sibling. Someone's friend. Someone who went to a peaceful protest and was murdered by their own government. And then erased. As if they'd never existed at all. October 12, 1968. 10 days after the massacre. The opening ceremony of the Mexico City Olympics. The stadium was packed. Thousands of athletes from around the world. Hundreds of thousands of spectators. Television cameras broadcasting to hundreds of millions watching globally. President Diaz Ordaz stood in the VIP box, smiling. Mexico had done it. The first Latin American nation to host the Olympics. A moment of national pride. And just 10 days earlier, his government had massacred hundreds of its own citizens. The contrast was jarring. Grotesque, even. The pageantry and celebration happening while the blood in Tlatelolco had barely dried. Many students had called for boycotting the Olympics. For international athletes to refuse to participate. To send a message that what happened in Tlatelolco was unacceptable. But it didn't happen. The Olympics went on. The world came to Mexico City. And for 16 days, attention focused on athletic competition while the massacre was barely mentioned. There was one moment, though. One protest that captured international attention. October 16th. The medal ceremony for the 200-meter sprint. 2 African American athletes, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, took gold and bronze respectively. As the American national anthem played, both men raised their fists in the air. The Black Power salute. A protest against racial injustice in the United States. It was powerful. It was controversial. It dominated headlines around the world. But here's something many people don't know: Smith and Carlos were also protesting Tlatelolco. In interviews later, both men said their protest wasn't just about American racial injustice. It was about solidarity with oppressed people everywhere. Including the Mexican students who'd been killed 10 days before the Olympics. We knew what had happened, Carlos said years later. The other athletes knew. People were talking about it in the Olympic Village. But nobody with real power was doing anything. So we did what we could. Their protest cost them dearly. They were expelled from the Olympic Village. Sent home from Mexico in disgrace. They faced death threats for years. But they'd made a point. They'd used their platform to say, "We see you. We stand with you. You haven't been forgotten." For the Mexican students, those still alive, those in hiding, those trying to process what had happened, that gesture meant everything. The Olympics concluded on October 27. Mexico was praised for hosting such a successful games. The government's narrative had held. To the world, Mexico looked stable, modern, successful. The massacre was barely a footnote. A minor disturbance that had been handled. Nothing to concern the international community. President Diaz Ordaz was triumphant. He'd gotten his Olympics. He'd crushed the student movement. He'd maintained control. And he'd gotten away with murder. Mass murder. Or so he thought. Because while the immediate crisis had passed, while the Olympics had come and gone, while the world's attention had moved on, something else was happening. In Mexico, people weren't forgetting. They couldn't forget. Too many families were missing someone. Too many people had seen what really happened. The government might control the official narrative. They might control the newspapers and the television stations. They might threaten and intimidate anyone who spoke out. But they couldn't control memory. They couldn't erase what people had witnessed. What they knew in their bones to be true. The truth about Tlatelolco was buried. But it wasn't dead. And over the coming years, decades, even, that truth would slowly, painfully, inevitably come to light. Before we go deeper into what came next, I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from right now? What time is it where you are? This story happened in Mexico in 1968, but its lessons about government violence and cover-ups are universal. Drop a comment with your location and let me know where in the world you're following this story. The students who survived Tlatelolco were forever changed. Some physically, carrying bullet wounds and broken bones for the rest of their lives. Others psychologically, traumatized by what they'd witnessed. And all of them burdened with a terrible knowledge: their government was willing to kill them for demanding change. Elena Poniatowska was a journalist. She wasn't a student herself, she was older, an established writer. But she'd been sympathetic to the student movement. Critical of the government. After Tlatelolco, she made it her mission to document what had really happened. She interviewed hundreds of survivors. Collected their testimonies. Their stories. It was dangerous work. The government was watching. People who spoke to her were sometimes visited afterward by security forces. Warned to stay quiet. But Elena persisted. And in 1971, she published a book, La Noche de Tlatelolco, The Night of Tlatelolco. It was a collection of testimonies. Voices of students who'd been there. Who'd seen the massacre. Who'd lost friends. Who'd barely escaped with their lives. The government hated the book. They couldn't ban it outright, that would be too obvious. But they made it hard to get. Bookstores were pressured not to stock it. People who sold it were harassed. But the book circulated anyway. Passed from hand to hand. Read in secret. It became essential reading for a generation trying to understand what their government had done. One of the testimonies in the book was from a student named Raul Alvarez. He'd been on the platform in Tlatelolco, one of the speakers at the rally. I was mid-sentence when the shooting started, he said in his testimony. I remember thinking, this can't be real. This can't be happening. We were peaceful. We were exercising our rights as citizens. Raul had been shot in the leg. He'd fallen from the platform. Other students had dragged him behind cover while bullets rained down around them. "I watched people die," he said. "Right in front of me. A girl, couldn't have been more than 17. Shot in the head. She didn't even have time to scream. She was just gone." Raoul survived. But he was arrested as he tried to leave the plaza. Beaten. Taken to a military prison. Tortured for 3 days before being released with a warning, "Don't talk about what happened, or you'll disappear." For years, Raoul stayed silent. The trauma. The fear. It was too much. But when Elena asked for his testimony, he gave it. Because silence, he realized, was what the government wanted. Silence let them get away with it. Another survivor was a young woman named Patricia. She'd been 19, a literature student. She'd gone to Tlatelolco with her boyfriend, Jorge. "We were holding hands when the shooting started," she remembered. "I felt his hand slip from mine. I turned and he was on the ground. Blood everywhere. I tried to help him, but people were running. Pushing. I got separated from him." Patricia never saw Jorge again. She searched for him at hospitals. At police stations. His name wasn't on any list of arrested. His body wasn't in any morgue she could access. Jorge was one of the disappeared. 20 years old. A brilliant mind. A bright future. Just gone. Patricia's testimony was raw. Painful. You could feel her grief bleeding through the words. "I think about him every day," she said. "Wonder what his life would have been. We'd talked about getting married. Having children. A future together. The government took that. They took everything." These testimonies, dozens of them in Elena's book, hundreds more that were never published, painted a picture very different from the government's official story. Not 20 or 30 dead. Hundreds. Maybe more. Not agitators firing first. Military and paramilitary forces systematically massacring unarmed civilians. Not order being maintained. A government murdering its own people to silence dissent. The book was important. It preserved the truth when the government was trying to bury it. It gave voice to people who'd been silenced. But it couldn't bring back the dead. Couldn't undo the trauma. Couldn't give justice to the families still searching for answers. For the student survivors of Tlatelolco, life went on. But it was never the same. How could it be? Some left Mexico. Fled to other countries where they might feel safe. Where they didn't have to live under a government that had tried to kill them. Others stayed. Became activists. Teachers. Writers. Determined to make sure Tlatelolco was never forgotten. That future generations would know what had happened. And all of them carried the weight of survival. The guilt of living when so many others had died. The burden of memory in a country that wanted to forget. The Mexican government didn't just lie about Tlatelolco in the immediate aftermath. They spent decades maintaining the lie. Enforcing it. Making it dangerous to question the official story. Evidence was destroyed. Military documents about the massacre were classified at the highest levels. Burn after reading. Eyes only. The kind of classification reserved for national security threats. The government position was simple: Tlatelolco was a closed matter. The official investigation had concluded. The death toll was established. Continuing to question it was unpatriotic. Dangerous. A threat to stability. Journalists who investigated too deeply found themselves unemployed. Newspapers that published critical stories faced government pressure. Advertising dried up. Distribution was blocked. It wasn't always overt censorship. Mexico in the 1970s and 80s still claimed to have press freedom. But the threats were real. The pressure was constant. Roberto Mendoza was a young journalist in 1972. He was working on a story about Tlatelolco. Talking to survivors. Trying to piece together what had really happened. One night, he got a visit. Men in suits. No badges. No identification. But the message was clear. They told me I should find a different story to work on, Roberto remembered. That this topic was not healthy for my career. They mentioned my wife by name. My daughter. They knew where my daughter went to school. Roberto killed the story. What else could he do? His family's safety was at stake. This is how the cover-up worked. Not always with overt violence. Sometimes just the threat of it. The implication that you and your family could become the next disappeared if you didn't stay quiet. Documents that should have been public record mysteriously vanished. Hospital records of gunshot wound victims from October 2nd. Police reports. Military communications. When families of the disappeared tried to file legal actions, they faced a bureaucratic maze designed to frustrate and exhaust them. Forms that needed signatures from officials who were never available. Required documents that had been lost. Hearings that were postponed indefinitely. The message was clear: give up. Move on. You'll never get answers. But some people refused to give up. Families of the disappeared formed organizations. Support groups that became advocacy groups. They met in secret at first, afraid that being too visible would make them targets. One such organization was the Comite del 68, Committee of 68. Formed by family members and survivors. Their goal: keep Tlatelolco in public consciousness. Demand justice. Refuse to let the dead be forgotten. Every year on October 2nd, they held a memorial march. It started small, maybe 100 people. Walking from the Angel of Independence to Tlatelolco. Carrying photographs of the dead and disappeared. The government tried to stop these marches. Sometimes with permits being denied. Sometimes with intimidation. Police showing up, taking photographs of participants, writing down names. But the marches happened anyway. And slowly, they grew. By the late 1980s, thousands were participating. Not just family members. Young people who'd been born after 1968 but wanted to honor what had happened. To say, we know. We remember. We won't forget. The government hated these marches. They were visible reminders that the official story was a lie. That people knew the truth and wouldn't be silenced. In 1988, on the 20th anniversary of Tlatelolco, the Memorial March was the largest yet. Over 10,000 people. They filled the streets from Angel de la Independencia all the way to Tlatelolco. The government had to acknowledge it. Had to let it happen. Because by then, too many people knew. Too many people cared. But acknowledging the memorial wasn't the same as acknowledging the truth. The government's official position hadn't changed. The death toll was still listed as 20 to 30. The massacre was still described as a necessary response to student agitators. The cover-up was cracking. But it wasn't broken. That would take more time. More pressure. And eventually, a change in government. While the Mexican government maintained its cover-up domestically, internationally, people were asking questions. Human rights organizations. International journalists. Foreign governments. They weren't subject to Mexican censorship. They could investigate. They could publish. They could demand answers. Amnesty International took up the case in the early 1970s. They interviewed refugees, Mexican students who'd fled the country after Tlatelolco, fearing for their lives. These refugees told consistent stories. Hundreds dead. Systematic violence. Government cover-up. Military involvement at the highest levels. Amnesty published reports. Called on the Mexican government to provide accurate information. To allow independent investigations. To hold perpetrators accountable. The Mexican government's response was predictable: these are lies. Foreign propaganda. Attempts to destabilize Mexico and damage its international reputation. But the reports kept coming. From different organizations. Different countries. All telling the same story. The Guardian in London published a lengthy investigation in 1976. They'd tracked down survivors living in exile in Europe. Former Mexican military members who'd left the country and were willing to talk. One former soldier described being part of the operation that night. The orders were clear, he said. Shoot to kill. Don't let anyone leave the plaza alive if possible. And afterward, dispose of bodies in ways that would make counting them impossible. We were told this was a matter of national security, the former soldier said. That the students were terrorists. Communist agitators funded by foreign powers. But when we got there, they were just kids. Holding signs. Singing. And we shot them. This soldier couldn't live with what he'd done. He'd deserted. Fled Mexico. Knew he could never go back. But he wanted the truth known. The Guardian's investigation estimated the death toll at between 300 and 400. Possibly more. Bodies had been incinerated. Dumped in mass graves. Thrown into remote ravines. Exact numbers would never be known. The Mexican government called the Guardian report sensationalist fiction. President Luis Echeverría, who'd been Interior Minister in 1968 and was heavily implicated in planning the massacre, threatened to sue for libel. Nothing came of that threat. Because suing would mean opening the case to international scrutiny. Would mean having to produce documents. Evidence. Testimony under oath. The government couldn't risk that. Because they knew what those documents and testimony would reveal. In 1978, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights received a petition from families of Tlatelolco victims. They asked the UN to investigate. To pressure Mexico to provide accurate information. To seek justice. The Commission agreed to look into it. They sent letters to the Mexican government requesting information. Access to documents. Permission to interview witnesses. Mexico stalled. Delayed. Gave vague responses. Finally said that since the incident happened 10 years ago and had been fully investigated at the time, there was nothing new to report. The UN investigation went nowhere. Not because there wasn't evidence of atrocity. But because the Mexican government refused to cooperate, and the UN had limited power to force them. But these international investigations served a purpose. They kept Tlatelolco in the global consciousness. They created a record, independent of Mexican government control, of what had really happened. They also gave hope to survivors and families in Mexico. The message was, you're not alone. You're not crazy. The world sees what your government did. And someday, there will be accountability. That someday seemed very far away in the 1970s and 80s. The PRI was still in power. The same party that had ordered the massacre. The same system that had covered it up. Nothing would change, it seemed, as long as the PRI controlled Mexico. But in the 1990s, something began to shift. The PRI's grip on power was loosening. Opposition parties were gaining strength. Democracy, real democracy, not the facade Mexico had maintained for decades, was becoming possible. And with it, the possibility that the truth about Tlatelolco might finally emerge. July 2000. For the first time in 71 years, the PRI lost the Mexican presidency. Vicente Fox, from the opposition PAN party, won the election. It was a watershed moment in Mexican democracy. The end of one-party rule. The beginning of something new. And for the families of Tlatelolco victims, it represented hope. Hope that maybe, finally, they could get answers. Fox had campaigned on transparency. On confronting Mexico's past. On opening government archives that had been sealed for decades. In 2001, he created the Special Prosecutor's Office for Past Social and Political Movements. Its mandate: investigate human rights abuses committed by the Mexican government in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Tlatelolco was at the top of the list. For the first time, investigators had access to government documents that had been classified since 1968. Military files. Intelligence reports. Internal communications from the highest levels of government. And what they found confirmed what survivors had been saying for decades. The massacre wasn't a spontaneous response to student agitators. It was planned. Ordered from the top. A deliberate act of state terrorism designed to crush the student movement before the Olympics. Documents showed that President Diaz Ordaz had personally approved the operation. Defense Minister Marcelino Garcia Barragan had coordinated military involvement. Interior Minister Luis Echeverria had overseen the Olympia Battalion, the paramilitary death squad that had infiltrated the protest. The plan was detailed. Specific. Snipers positioned in buildings. Ground forces blocking exits. The flares serving as signals to coordinate the attack. It was all there. In writing. In government files. The death toll was also documented more accurately. Internal military reports listed at least 360 confirmed deaths. With notations that this number was incomplete and likely much lower than actual total. Some reports mentioned mass graves. Bodies burned in military crematoriums. Wounded prisoners who were eliminated to prevent them from testifying. Reading these documents was devastating for the families who'd been searching for truth for over 30 years. Ana Maria Jimenez, who'd been looking for her brother Carlos since 1968, finally had confirmation. Carlos had been arrested alive. Taken to a military prison. Interrogated. Tortured. And then killed. Disposed of, the file said. That cold, bureaucratic language. As if her brother was waste to be discarded. At least I know now, Ana Maria said when the files were released. At least he's not just a question mark anymore. But knowing what they did to him, knowing he suffered. God, I wish I could unknow it. The files also revealed the extent of the cover-up. Explicit orders to destroy evidence. To lie about the death toll. To intimidate witnesses. To create a false narrative and enforce it through state power. One particularly chilling document was a memo from Luis Echeverria to military intelligence. It instructed them to identify and neutralize anyone spreading false rumors about Tlatelolco. Neutralize was understood to mean kill or disappear. Several journalists and activists had indeed disappeared or been killed in the years after Tlatelolco. Now there was documentation connecting their deaths to the massacre cover-up. The Special Prosecutor's Office released its findings in 2006. The report was hundreds of pages long. Meticulously documented. Impossible to dismiss as propaganda or exaggeration. The conclusion was clear: the Mexican government, at the highest levels, had committed a massacre of its own citizens. And then covered it up for decades. The report recommended that criminal charges be filed against those responsible. Including Luis Echeverria, who was still alive. Echeverria was in his 80s by then. He'd gone on to be president of Mexico from 1970 to 1976. He'd lived a comfortable life while the families of his victims searched for their children. In 2006, he was finally arrested. Charged with genocide. The legal argument was that Tlatelolco was an attempt to destroy, in whole or in part, a social group, the student movement. It was historic. A former Mexican president charged with such a serious crime. Families of victims wept when they heard the news. Finally, accountability. But then, nothing. The courts dismissed the charges. Said too much time had passed. That the statute of limitations had expired. That proving Echeverria's direct involvement would be too difficult. He was released. He would never face trial. Never be held accountable. He died in 2022, at age 100, having never been punished for his role in Tlatelolco. It was a bitter pill for the families. The truth had been revealed. The files had been opened. But justice? That was still out of reach. You can know facts about Tlatelolco. You can read the reports. Study the documents. Understand the politics and the cover-up. But to really understand what happened, you have to understand the emotional toll. On the survivors. On the families. On Mexico as a whole. Let's talk about trauma. Real trauma. The kind that lasts a lifetime. Raul Alvarez, the student who'd been shot while speaking at the rally, lived for another 50 years after Tlatelolco. He got married. Had children. Had a career as a teacher. But he never really left that plaza. I had nightmares, he said in an interview in 2010. 4 decades. I'd dream I was back there. Hearing the shots. Watching people fall. I'd wake up screaming. My wife got used to it. But I never did. Raul developed PTSD. So did many survivors. In 1968, they didn't even have a name for it. Didn't understand why survivors couldn't just move on. Why they were haunted by what they'd witnessed. Patricia, the young woman who'd lost her boyfriend Jorge in the massacre, never married. Never had the family she'd dreamed of. How could I, she said. Every relationship I tried, I'd sabotage it. I couldn't trust. Couldn't open up. I was stuck in that night. Forever 19 years old, holding Jorge's hand one moment, and the next, gone. Patricia became a prominent activist. Fought for decades to get the truth about Tlatelolco revealed. But it was also a way to avoid dealing with her own grief. To channel pain into purpose. I threw myself into the cause, she admitted. Because stopping meant feeling. And feeling meant drowning in grief. So I just kept moving. And the families of the disappeared. God, the families. There's a special kind of torture in not knowing. In having someone you love just vanish. No body to bury. No closure. No answers. Ana Maria Jimenez, looking for her brother Carlos, described it as living in permanent limbo. For years, I'd see someone on the street who looked like Carlos from behind. And my heart would stop. Just for a second. Maybe he's alive. Maybe he's been in hiding. Maybe today he comes home. And then the person would turn around and it wasn't him. It was never him. But that hope never died. That's what they took from us. The ability to grieve properly. To let go. This was true for hundreds of families. They couldn't fully mourn because there was always that tiny, impossible hope. What if their loved one was alive somewhere? What if they'd been imprisoned and would one day be released? Even when the files were opened in the 2000s. Even when families got confirmation their loved ones were dead. There was still no body. No grave. Just words on a page saying, disposed of. The psychological toll extended beyond direct victims and families. An entire generation of Mexicans grew up knowing their government had massacred students. That speaking out against injustice could get you killed. It created a culture of fear, of self-censorship, of learned helplessness. Why bother demanding change? Why risk protesting? Look what happened to the students in '68. This trauma was passed down. Parents who'd lived through Tlatelolco, either directly or knowing someone who had, raised their children with warnings. Don't get involved in politics. Don't protest. Don't make yourself a target. For decades, Mexican civil society was quieter than it should have been. Not because people didn't care about injustice, but because Tlatelolco had taught them that caring could be fatal. But trauma is complex, because it also inspired. Some people responded to Tlatelolco not with fear but with determination. A determination that it could never happen again. That the victims hadn't died in vain. The annual October 2nd memorial marches became a space for processing collective grief. For saying, we remember. We honor. We will not forget. Elena Poniatowska's book became a tool for healing. By sharing testimonies, by giving voice to survivors, it helped people feel less alone in their pain. And the activists who kept fighting for decades, they were driven by a refusal to let trauma have the last word. To let the government's violence and lies define what Tlatelolco meant. They killed our friends, one survivor said. They wanted to kill our hope too. To make us afraid. To silence us. But by keeping the memory alive, by fighting for truth, we denied them that victory. The emotional toll of Tlatelolco is still being paid. Survivors in their 70s and 80s still carry the weight. Children of the disappeared, now grandparents themselves, still search for closure. And Mexico as a nation is still processing what it means that this happened. That a government did this to its own people. That it was covered up for so long. Truth is important. Justice is important. But healing? Healing takes longer. Even with the files opened. Even with the truth documented. Justice for Tlatelolco remains incomplete. Luis Echeverria escaped prosecution. He died without ever being held accountable. So did most of the others involved in planning and executing the massacre. President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz died in 1979. Defense Minister Garcia Barragan in 1979. Most of the military commanders who'd been on the ground that night are dead now too. The mid-level soldiers who'd pulled the triggers? Most of them are dead or in their 80s and 90s. In 2024, prosecuting them is more symbolic than practical. But families still want accountability. Still push for it. In 2020, on the 52nd anniversary of the massacre, a new legal complaint was filed. This time targeting not individuals but the Mexican state itself. Seeking recognition of state responsibility. Reparations for families. The case is still working its way through the courts. Legal analysts are skeptical it will succeed. Mexico's legal system doesn't easily allow for prosecuting historical state crimes. But the filing itself matters. It keeps Tlatelolco in public consciousness. It refuses to let the dead be forgotten. There have been some small victories. In 2021, the Mexican government officially apologized for Tlatelolco. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador acknowledged what happened. Called it a terrible act that stained our history. It was the first time a sitting Mexican president had officially acknowledged the truth about Tlatelolco. The first time the government admitted the scale of what happened. For families who'd fought for decades to get even basic acknowledgement, it was emotional. Tears. Hugs. A sense of finally being heard. But an apology isn't justice. It doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't punish the perpetrators. It doesn't provide material reparations to families who've suffered for over 50 years. Some survivors and families rejected the apology as too little, too late. They wanted action, not words. What would justice actually look like at this point? It's a question without easy answers. Trials are difficult. Most perpetrators are dead. Evidence is old. Witnesses' memories are faded. But there are things that could be done. Full release of all government documents related to Tlatelolco. Some files are still classified. A comprehensive, government-funded effort to locate and identify remains of the disappeared. Use modern forensic techniques. Give families a chance to bury their loved ones. Financial reparations to families. Compensation for decades of suffering, for lost loved ones. Educational programs ensuring that Tlatelolco is taught in schools. That future generations understand what happened. Official memorials. Beyond the plaques that already exist, something more substantial. A museum. A memorial park. Something that honors the victims and educates the public. Some of this has happened. There are educational programs. Memorials. But it's incomplete. Underfunded. Not treated with the seriousness it deserves. The annual October 2nd March continues. In 2023, it was the 55th anniversary. Thousands marched from Angel de la Independencia to Tlatelolco. Survivors in their 70s and 80s. Their children and grandchildren. Young activists who weren't born in 1968 but carry forward the memory. They chant. They carry photographs of the dead. They light candles. They refuse to forget. Because forgetting is what the government wanted all along. Forgetting is how they get away with it. One of the marchers in 2023 was Sophia, age 23. She's the granddaughter of a Tlatelolco survivor. My grandmother was there, Sophia said. She saw people killed. She barely escaped. She raised my mother to never forget. And my mother raised me the same way. This is our history. This is our family story. And it's Mexico's story. We can't let it be buried. This is how memory survives. Passed down. Generation to generation. Each telling of the story an act of resistance against enforced forgetting. But memory isn't enough. The families want justice. Deserve justice. And until that justice comes, if it ever comes, they'll keep marching. Keep demanding. Keep refusing to let the dead be forgotten. Because Tlatelolco isn't just history. It's a living wound. Still bleeding. Still unhealed. And it will remain so until Mexico truly confronts what happened. Takes full responsibility. And ensures that nothing like it can ever happen again. Tlatelolco didn't happen in a vacuum. It was part of a pattern. A pattern of state violence against students and activists that played out across the world in the 1960s and beyond. Think about it. What else happened in 1968? In Paris, French students protested and were met with police violence. Not as deadly as Tlatelolco, but violent nonetheless. In Czechoslovakia, Soviet tanks rolled in to crush the Prague Spring, a movement for democratic reform. In the United States, police violently suppressed protests at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. In Northern Ireland, civil rights marchers were attacked in what became known as Bloody Sunday in Derry. 1968 was a year of young people demanding change. And governments responding with force. But Tlatelolco was different in scale. Different in its deliberateness. Different in the lengths the government went to cover it up. And it set a precedent. A playbook for how authoritarian governments could deal with dissent. In 1971, Mexico had another student protest. The Corpus Christi Massacre, also known as the Halconazo. Students marching in Mexico City were attacked by a paramilitary group called Los Halcones, the Hawks. Over 100 students were killed. The government denied responsibility, just like with Tlatelolco. But everyone knew. It was the same playbook. Create a paramilitary force. Give them a green light. Then deny everything. This pattern repeated across Latin America through the 1970s and 80s. Argentina's dirty war. Chile under Pinochet. Guatemala. El Salvador. Brazil. In each case, governments used similar tactics: death squads, forced disappearances, torture, systematic violence against leftist students and activists. And in each case, cover-ups. Denials. Official death tolls that were lies. Families searching for disappeared loved ones, getting no answers. Tlatelolco was a template. And other governments learned from it. But there's another parallel worth noting. The way Tlatelolco was covered up. That's still happening today. In 1989, China's government massacred pro-democracy students in Tiananmen Square. The official death toll? The Chinese government says 241. Independent estimates range from hundreds to thousands. Sound familiar? The Chinese government has spent decades enforcing a version of Tiananmen that downplays what happened. Censoring information. Punishing people who talk about it. Trying to make younger generations forget it even happened. It's the Tlatelolco playbook. 50 years later. Different country. Same tactics. In 2011, Syria's government violently suppressed pro-democracy protests. Thousands killed. Thousands disappeared. The government's response? Denials. Claims that protesters were terrorists. Foreign agitators. Again, the same pattern. This is what makes studying Tlatelolco so important. It's not just about honoring the dead, though that matters tremendously. It's about understanding how governments use violence against their own people. How they cover it up. How they enforce silence. How they rely on time-eroding memory. And how citizens resist. How they keep truth alive despite enormous pressure. How memory becomes an act of defiance. The lessons of Tlatelolco are clear. Document everything. Don't rely on government sources. Get independent accounts. Photos. Videos. Testimony. Because official stories will lie. Don't let time erase memory. The government wants people to forget. To move on. To stop asking questions. Resist that. Keep the conversation alive. Support survivors and families. They're not just demanding justice for their loved ones. They're demanding accountability that protects everyone. Demand transparency. Classified documents. Secret operations. These are tools of cover-up. Push for openness. Never believe it can't happen here. Tlatelolco happened in Mexico, a country that had a veneer of democracy. That positioned itself as stable and modern. If it could happen there, it can happen anywhere. Pay attention to warning signs. When governments demonize protesters. When they use extreme force against peaceful demonstrations. When they control information. These are red flags. The students in 1968 saw their government as corrupt. As authoritarian despite democratic pretenses. They demanded change. And for that, they were massacred. But their demand for change wasn't wrong. They were right about their government. They were right to protest. The tragedy isn't that they were naive or misguided. The tragedy is that their government responded to legitimate demands with bullets. Understanding Tlatelolco means understanding that pattern. Recognizing it. And refusing to let it repeat. We're in 2024 now. 56 years after Tlatelolco. And families are still searching. Still searching for bodies. For remains. For any trace of their loved ones who disappeared that night. Because while the files have been opened, while the truth has been documented, while apologies have been issued. Hundreds of people who disappeared in October 1968 have never been found. Their families don't have graves to visit, don't have remains to bury, don't have closure. Ana Maria Jimenez is in her 80s now. She's spent more of her life searching for her brother Carlos than she had with him before he disappeared. "I'm old now," she said in a 2023 interview. "I won't live much longer. And I've accepted that I'll probably die without finding him. Without having a place to go to talk to him. To bring him flowers. To say goodbye." She paused. Composed herself. "But I hope, I pray, that after I'm gone, someone will keep looking. My children. My grandchildren. Someone. Because Carlos deserves to be found. To be brought home. Even if it's just his bones." This is the reality for so many families. The search continues. Has become multi-generational. Grandchildren looking for grandparents they never met. There have been some successes. Some remains have been found and identified through modern DNA testing. In 2019, bones found in a mass grave outside Mexico City were identified through DNA as belonging to a Tlatelolco victim. A young man who'd been 18 when he disappeared. His sister, now 75 years old, finally had him back. Finally could bury him properly. After 51 years. She described it as bittersweet. Relief mixed with renewed grief. Finally having answers. But also confronting again what had been done to her brother. Forensic anthropologists in Mexico continue to work on identifying remains. But it's difficult. Bodies were disposed of in ways meant to prevent identification. Burned. Dumped in acid. Scattered. And 56 years is a long time. Even bones degrade. Evidence disappears. Some of the disappeared will never be found. That's the hard truth. But the search continues because giving up feels like letting the government win. Like accepting that these people can just be erased. Disappeared. Forgotten. The families refuse to accept that. There's an organization in Mexico called Hasta Encontrarlos, Until We Find Them. It was started by families of people who disappeared during the Dirty War in the 1970s and 80s. But they've also taken up the cause of Tlatelolco. They use modern technology. DNA databases. Forensic techniques. They search old military sites. Abandoned buildings. Any place bodies might have been dumped. Their work is painstaking. Heartbreaking. But necessary. Because every person found is a person no longer disappeared.